Hey guys, today we're going to be looking at the presidency of Lyndon Johnson, frequently referred to as LBJ, focusing on the years of 1964 to 1968. Here are your key questions and your vocabulary. All right, so let's start by looking at the election of 1964. LBJ took over from JFK in 1963 after JFK was assassinated. LBJ is a very different president from JFK. JFK was young and charismatic. LBJ is not so much. He is a tough guy. He's a big guy. He's like 6'3", and he's not so much about making pretty speeches. He's about getting stuff done behind the scenes. He is really good at getting people to line up and support his stuff, convincing people to back him up. And he is deeply committed to liberal reforms. So even though he's got a very different style from JFK, he's committed to the same issues that JFK supported. He wants reform in education, civil rights, and medical care. Opposed to LBJ in the election of 1964 is Barry Goldwater. Barry Goldwater represents a new kind of Republican candidate and is kind of a messenger of a new sort of conservative party that is going to become more powerful in future years. So Barry Goldwater is very conservative, and he represents this idea that the federal government should do much, much less than it currently does. He opposes the federal income tax, which is the main way that the federal government makes money. He opposes most of the New Deal reforms put in place by FDR. He opposes any action on civil rights by the federal government. And he opposes limiting nuclear weapons testing. Basically, he wants to keep the nuclear arms race going and take a very strong line against Russia, in spite of the fact that we almost blew the world up back in the early 60s with the Cuban Missile Crisis. But anyway, it's a very, very stark choice, and the United States chooses dramatically in favor of LBJ, resulting in a landslide victory for the Democrats. So just real quick, here is a picture of the electoral map for 1964. And you'll see that LBJ basically won all the states except for Arizona, which is where Barry Goldwater was from, and then the Deep South. And the reason that Goldwater won the Deep South was because he opposed civil rights reform. And this is important because the South was traditionally Democratic. And the fact that the South is now voting for the Republicans is the beginning of a switch in which the South and rural areas in general are going to start to support the Republican Party, and the North is going to become the stronghold of the Democratic Party, which is kind of the opposite of how it had been previously. Anyway, with this landslide victory for LBJ, the Democrats now control the presidency and Congress and are set to make some pretty major changes and reforms now that they control the government. The major issue of the LBJ years was the tension between his desire to reform stuff in the United States and his increasing commitment to the war in Vietnam. And what we're going to look at is, first we're going to look at LBJ's domestic reforms, the reforms that he wanted to carry out in the United States. And he called this the Great Society. And it was a package of reforms designed to make life better in the United States for disadvantaged groups of people. And then we're going to turn to look at the Vietnam War and see how the Vietnam War in many ways kind of undercut and prevented the Great Society from being fully implemented. And the main reason for this is that the Vietnam War is a huge distraction and costs a lot of money and prevents LBJ from getting everything done that he wants to get done in terms of the Great Society. And this picture here is a good kind of summary of LBJ's presidency. He wanted it to be about the Great Society, but instead his image was dominated by scenes of horror and violence coming from the war in Vietnam. So let's first look at the Great Society and think about the ways in which President Johnson was successful. He did get a lot done in his first years as president. So some of the main programs of the Great Society that he manages to implement are the War on Poverty, federal aid for education, government-funded medical care for the poor and elderly. That is the programs Medicare and Medicaid, respectively. Medicare is for old people, Medicaid is for poor people. He passed immigration reform, and he repealed the restrictive quota system that had been put in place in the 1920s. This resulted in drastic increases in immigration from Latin America, and has led today to people from Latin America being the largest minority group in the United States. And last of all, he took decisive action in the field of civil rights and passed the Civil Rights Act in 1964 and then the Voting Rights Act in 1965. And we're not going to talk about these a lot today, but we're going to review them in more detail in the next lecture. So anyway, all of these represent pretty significant victories for Johnson, and they are they increase the power of the federal government, and the federal government is now using federal money to help build up communities and eliminate poverty throughout the United States. This, of course, is incredibly expensive, but Johnson and other liberals think that this is worthwhile because they think that helping the neediest people in the United States is sort of a moral obligation of the country. Now let's turn to look at Vietnam, or as LBJ would have said it, Vietnam. So when LBJ takes office, there are about 16,000 quote-unquote advisors in Vietnam. And these advisors were not supposed to be directly fighting the North Vietnamese, but were supposed to be sort of training and assisting the South Vietnamese army. But it's very clear that the army of South Vietnam is not going to be able to cut it, and that if the United States wants to keep South Vietnam from going communist, they're going to have to dramatically increase their commitment. And this happens in 1964 when the United States passes the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution. And the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution was basically the switch that allowed the United States to begin fighting North Vietnam directly. So instead of advising, now you have US soldiers going in and fighting against people from North Vietnam. This resolution was supposedly a response to attacks by North Vietnam against US ships, but there were two attacks. The first attack appears to be incredibly minor, and the second one we now know was entirely made up. So the US government's justification for going to war against Vietnam was based on very, very flimsy evidence. So anyway, it's not clear that Johnson knew this, but Johnson decides on the basis of this to call for an increasing number of troops, and he thinks that by just sort of bringing the US military power to bear against Vietnam, that we'll be able to crush North Vietnam pretty quickly, because after all, they're a small, poor country, and that we'll be able to unify the country under capitalism and go home. And so Johnson calls for an increasing number of troops to make this happen. And in order to get these troops, the United States relies on the draft, which is where young men in the United States are essentially forced to join the military. And it's kind of like a random lottery system where soldiers are called up according to a number, and if your number comes up, you gotta go. And over the course of the war from 1965 to 1972, 1.7 million young men were drafted. And this includes a large proportion of poor young men and also minority men. The United States Army at this point is integrated, so black and white soldiers are now fighting together. And this becomes a source of controversy because civil rights leaders argue that since black men don't get their equal rights in the United States, that maybe it's not necessary for them to be fighting for the United States. After all, why should they fight for a country that doesn't give them civil rights and equality? We'll get back to that when we view the civil rights movement in next week's lecture. So Vietnam does not go well, and Johnson's assumption that the United States would be able to crush North Vietnam with its superior technology and firepower was incorrect. The North Vietnamese fight a type of war known as a guerrilla war. In Spanish, it means the little war. So rather than fighting these giant battles in open fields, the North Vietnamese rely on guerrilla tactics in order to take down the bigger and more powerful U.S. Army. And how they do this is they use the terrain of Vietnam to their advantage. They hide in the dense jungles and the rugged mountains of Vietnam, places where the United States can't really fight them in sort of giant battles. You can't drive tanks through the jungles. You can't, it's just really difficult. And so by fighting in the jungles and fighting in the mountains, the North Vietnamese are kind of force the United States to fight them on their own terms. The North Vietnamese know the territory very well, and they're able to booby trap the trails and important passes through mountains. They're able to launch surprise attacks, and they receive support from the local population. The Vietnamese, even people in South Vietnam, support the North Vietnamese soldiers, and many people in Vietnam view the United States as simply a new imperial power that is trying to replace the French, who were kicked out in 1954. On top of this, the Vietnamese are able to travel through the neighboring country of Cambodia in order to launch surprise attacks where the United States is weak. So this is a very, very difficult position, and the United States, in spite of all of its money and all of its firepower, finds itself basically unable to do any damage or to achieve any significant victories against North Vietnam. And as time goes on, the cost of the war continues to build. Over the years, hundreds of thousands of Americans are either killed or wounded in the war, and the United States spends $173 billion funding this war. And if you take into account inflation, that means the United States has spent about $1.1 trillion in today's money, which is an incredible amount. On top of this, the United States uses its advanced technology and its Air Force to drop all sorts of bombs on Vietnam. In fact, they dropped more bombs on Vietnam than all of the bombs that were dropped during World War II. And this is not very good for the U.S. international image. Nations around the world condemn the United States and say that the United States is behaving unjustly and that they have no business fighting in this war. And in spite of all these costs, the United States essentially makes no progress. As a result of these costs and also of the perceived injustice of the war, a anti-war movement begins in the United States and grows throughout the course of the Vietnam War. The draft, which was instituted or came into greater and greater effect as the war went on, triggers massive opposition among the baby boomer generation, because the baby boomers are now about the age at which you get drafted, and they represent a very large portion of the US population. And so when the baby boomers mobilize against the draft, you see a very powerful political force sort of coming into existence. You can see the people there protesting the war. You can tell they're mostly young people, and these are the baby boomers taking action against the draft and against the war in general. Also, public figures and celebrities begin speaking out against the war and questioning the judgment of the government. These are people like the famous boxer Muhammad Ali and other actors, people like Jane Fonda, people you don't probably know about, but celebrities, people who are very popular among younger Americans, start to say the government's been lying to us, the government doesn't know what it's doing, the war in Vietnam is unwinnable, or that it's unjust. And as the war escalates and as the costs increase, the protests become bigger and some become violent as the police try to crack down on protesters. And so, viewed from the outside, it looks like America is starting to fall apart as it divides over whether or not to support the troops and support the war. As a result of all this, when 1968 comes around and it's time to run for re-election, LBJ decides to bow out. Generals are calling for even more troops to be sent to Vietnam, but the protests are becoming increasingly violent, and Johnson is starting to face challenges from within his own party. There are a number of candidates running. Most famously, Robert F. Kennedy, the brother of JFK, is leading an anti-war insurgency within the Democratic Party. So even though Johnson is a Democrat, Robert F. Kennedy is campaigning to become president. So the Democrats are rebelling against their own president. That's how unpopular the war has become. And so because of this extreme unpopularity, LBJ decides not to run again. And what this means is that lots of these promises that Johnson had made with the Great Society and lots of the goals that he hoped to achieve are going to be left unfinished because of all the money and all the time and all the anger that the Vietnam War stirred up. So Johnson came in with a very promising set of ideas, but as the result of the war, he was unable to carry them out. All right, so that's our video for this week. We will tune in next week to look at the civil rights movement during the 1960s. So thanks for paying attention.